Now let's look at animating a camera and make something a little bit more interesting than just a static image. So I've got my scene, and I do have a camera already in the scene. I'm going to show you a couple of different ways that you can animate a camera. First, we'll just do a basic 360 kind of turnaround.
Yeah, that's what I was.
And then we'll do something a little bit more complicated. So I have a camera already in here, and we'll show that. And I'll select the camera that's currently in there. We can hide that. And I'll jump to my camera 2 perspective, and I haven't set this one up yet, so I'll do that real quick. I'm going to select the camera and go to camera 2 with the shape node, and I want to set film gate to 1.85, and I'm going to set my display options to display the film gate overscan of 2. Let's go 2.4. There we go. So now I can see the edges of my frame. And for 360, what I want to do is make sure I can see the whole house. So I'll set my focal length to like 24. And let's move everything up a little bit. And we'll move the camera away. And so, to animate just a 360, all you need to do is grab the camera group. So in the outliner here, it's going to grab the camera 2 group. It's going to grab both the look target and the camera. And I'm just going to rotate it around. I'll get the outliner out of the way. As I rotate it, you can see a preview on the left here of what that animation is going to be. So I can just kind of go through it first and make sure that the camera's not going to clip on the fence and do anything I don't want it to do. That looks pretty good. I might grab the camera aim and move it up just a little bit. Give the house a little more headroom. Grab the group, and again I'll just go through and do the rotation again and make sure that I'm happy with it from all sides. That looks pretty good. Okay. So to animate this, if you remember all the way back to week 1 when we did the solar system, I'm going to select my group, okay, camera 2 group, and I'm just animating rotate Y. So I'm going to highlight rotate Y, I'm going to right click on it and key the selected. Make sure you're at frame 1. Okay, so frame 1, rotate Y. And then we need to figure out how long we want this rotation to be. Normal film is 24 frames a second. And let's say we do a 10-second rotation, then that means we want to be at 240 frames. So down here, next to the time slider, I'm going to set this to 240. Okay, this is the end time of the animation, set that to 240. And I will go to that frame. I'm going to set my rotate Y to 360. I'm going to right click on it and key selected. Okay, so now I have a keyframe at frame 240.
What are you supposed to key?
Scrub through my timeline and see how that's going. If I want to actually preview the animation here in my camera view, I'll just tap spacebar to make that a little bit larger, and then I will hit play, and we can see what this is going to look like. And it's just a pretty standard 360-degree view. That looks great. If you're having some issues with this animation, either maybe it's going way too fast, if we go down to our animation preferences, which is this little icon on the bottom right, it looks like a man running away from a giant gear. Click on that. It's going to open up your animation preferences for the time slider. And you can set your frame rate. Again, we want to be 24 frames a second. Animation start and end, you can set those here. But really importantly is your playback speed. You want to make sure that that is 24 frames a second times 1. Right, that's normal speed. If you do play every frame, it's going to play back the animation as fast as it absolutely can without dropping a frame, which in most cases is way too fast for simple animations. If we do 24 frames a second times 0.5, it's going to play back at half speed, and times 2 is double speed. You can also do other and type in your custom speed. But we want it times 1, just normal speed. We can also set the update view to all. If we do that, click Save. Now when I play this back side by side, we will see the animation happen in both views, which is rather convenient. If things are kind of chugging and going slower than they should, then maybe you need to turn that off. But for this, I think it's helpful to have it on both. So those are the animation preferences. We can play it back and make sure it's good. And I'm happy with that. You can also adjust your animation, your frame rate with this drop down here. So once I have my animation set, now I need to render it. So I'm going to open up my render preferences. I'm going to back off my render settings for this, just for demonstration purposes. And I'm going to go to my Common tab. File name prefix will say cam 2 underscore, and so that'll leave space for the number, the frame number, and then stay with JPEG frame animation extension. So we need to change that to a non-single frame option. Again, I like name underscore extension right here, the last one. So actually I probably don't need this underscore. Just keep it at cam 2. I need to set my frame range. So again, I'm 1 to 240. That's going to be my end frame. We want to render camera 2. And that's good. I'm going to keep it at 720 for this example. I'm going to back off my samples just a little bit more, again, for demonstration purposes. I'm also going to turn off motion blur so it doesn't take forever to render. So that's all the settings that I need to adjust. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to maximize this window so I'm looking at the view that I want to render. I'm going to just render just a regular still frame, and I'm going to do that, if it actually pops up here. There we go. Because I want to know how long this is going to take to render one frame. Because then I can get an estimate of how long it's going to take to render 240 frames. So it just finished rendering, and it took 8 seconds to render. So if we multiply 8 by 240 frames, we get 1920 seconds. Right, that's 8 seconds by 240 frames, so that's 1920 seconds. Seconds. If we divide that by 60, it's going to be 32 minutes to render all 240 frames. That's a pretty quick render, right? Our quality is pretty low, but it's still going to take half an hour to do. So as you're increasing, and remember when we had 4 samples, it took 16 seconds, so that would be an hour for a 240 second render. Remember the samples that we had at like 5, it took almost 2 minutes. So if you take 2 minutes times 240 frames gives you 480 minutes. We divide that by 60. That's 8 hours for a 10-second animation. You can see why these things can take some time and why Pixar has a massive, massive render farm. So it's good to do this just to plan ahead, and one, to make sure that you have your samples set so that you don't have a whole lot of noise, but two, so you know how long something is going to take to render, and you can plan accordingly. Don't wait until the last day or the day of to render your animations. I say this every year. People ignore me every year, and projects get turned in later, not at all every year. But please don't be one of those people. There's no excuse. You've got 2 weeks to get this turned in. Once I'm happy with my settings, then I can close this view, and to render, we want to go to our rendering menu set. Excuse me. Okay, and so that is, remember this drop down on the top left, it says modeling right now. We want to go to rendering, and then we're going to go to the render menu, and we can check the render sequence settings. We want to make sure we're on camera 2. And all that's good. And then we can just hit render sequence. So this is going to start rendering every frame. Take a second to begin, and then it'll get going. It's going to render one frame, and we know this will take about 8 seconds. As soon as it finishes that frame, it's going to start on the next frame. So it's going to render it, it's going to save it, and then there we go, onto the next frame. You can also, if you go to your either Finder or file browser of choice, if you navigate to your project folder and you go to your images folder in the project, you'll see the images starting to pop in there. Okay. Now, the first two you're not really going to see any animation because it's a pretty small and slow move at the beginning, but they'll eventually start popping in. Now, they go to the images folder because I have my project set, which is something that you should all be still continuing to do, is working out of a Maya project and setting your project and making sure you're following all those best practices, because that's going to keep everything together, and it's still all just in my project folder. And then if I was to turn this in, I would just have to zip up this one folder. Everything would come with it. Still renders all of these individual frames, textures, and the scene files all comes with it together. Cancel this render. To do that, I'm just going to hit escape. It'll stop.
How do you see it like that?
For a crash. So, showed how to do the 360 camera. Now let's cover a more interesting but a little bit more of an involved camera animation technique. I'm perfectly happy if you guys just do the 360, but if you want to do a little bit more, get a little more interest, this is how you can do that. So I'm going to create a new camera, and this will be a camera and aim, and let's move that to a decent starting point. So I'm going to set my aim target to about the front door. Well, let's actually say maybe the flowers in front of the door. Alright, and then my camera will move into position. I'm going to set my left view here, panels, perspective, camera 3. And I'm going to move it kind of over here by the fence. I'm going to do a wide angle on this as well. And we'll set my film back to 1.85. And I'll scroll down, display options, display the film gate, set my overscan to 2.4. Okay, so now I can see what my camera sees. I can see it accurately. I want to see a little bit of the fence here in the shot, so we'll do something like that, and maybe I'll move my look target up a little bit. Okay, that looks like a nicely composed first frame. So, much like before, I'm going to set a keyframe on my translation. I can't set a keyframe on my rotate values. Okay, these you see these blue bars by rotate X, Y, and Z. That's because the camera's rotation is being driven by this look target. Okay, so the camera's looking here, and that's what's determining the rotation of the camera. I can't individually set that, but that's fine. So I'm going to set my keyframes for translate X, Y, and Z. Right-click, key selected. Now I'm going to move forward, and instead of doing a full rotation, I'm just going to kind of move it to each place that I want it to be and when I want it to be, and set a keyframe. So I'm going to have, first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to have the camera kind of dolly across the fence towards the opening and towards the path here in the center. So I'll move forward to like frame 40. And then with the camera, I'll select the camera and I'll move it to just as it clears the fence. Okay, and I'm going to right click and key selected, so add another keyframe. I can also turn on automatic keyframing, which is this icon down here next to animation preferences. So I turn that on, it turns red. Now anytime I adjust the translation, it's going to automatically set another keyframe. I have to set the first keyframe, but after that it'll set the next keyframes automatically. So now I'm going to move forward another, let's say 60 frames, and let's zoom in here on the window maybe, something like that. Okay, and you can see because I adjusted the X and the Z position, it automatically set those keyframes. It didn't set a keyframe on Y because I didn't move it up and down. I just kept it at the same height, and that's fine. So from here, what I can do is I can adjust, I can keep going and kind of fly through in a more dynamic way. I can adjust the roll of the camera if I want to. I can adjust where the target is. I can animate the target, the camera target itself, the same sort of way. So let's say back here by the fence, I select my aim target, camera 3 aim. I'm going to set a keyframe for translate X, Y, and Z. And then as I move up to frame 60, maybe I want the camera to tilt down a little bit and kind of focus on the flowers here. Okay, I can make that adjustment. Okay, so now that keyframe is set. And so the look target moves, the camera moves. You can also adjust depth of the field. All right, you can set a keyframe for that. So maybe here at first, on the first frame, I want the camera to be focused on the fence. So let's say 2.2. So I'm going to select my camera. I'm going to go to my attribute editor. In my Arnold section, we're going to turn on depth of field. I'm going to set my focus distance to 2.2 and my aperture size something pretty small. Okay, we'll hit render and test this out. See how it looks. Make sure we're rendering the correct camera, so I want to change that to camera 3. Okay, the fence is in focus, good. The house is out of focus, that's great. That's what I want. So now I can right click on focus distance and set the key. Okay, so now that's got a keyframe on it. And then I can move to frame, let's say right about here I want the house to be in focus. So now I need to, we'll click on the front door. That distance is 13.63. So I'll change the focus distance to 13.63. And now I can check that focus in my render view. The house is in focus, the fence is now out of focus. And now I'm pulling focus, right? I'm racking focus as I go. I also need to make sure that I set the keyframe and that keys. Okay. So now see if we, and this is going to be a tough thing to render in real time. But you can see the fence goes from in focus and then we full focus and now the house is in focus. That's a nice little extra bit of dynamic change. Gives a little more interest to the shot. Okay, I'll close that for now. So once you go through and kind of block in your camera animation, you can play it back, see how it looks. Now, I see a big problem there, and I want to fix that. And that's that the camera's moving along, and it's going at a decent pace, maybe a little fast, but it's okay. But as soon as it turns that corner, it like zooms in real fast, or moves in real fast. It's not actually zooming. And that's more than I want. So I need to make some adjustments to that motion. And I'm going to show a couple of new things that I haven't really covered yet. We're going to get into animation kind of in a more proper way in a couple of weeks, but just for making this adjustment, I'm going to try not to make this a little too overwhelming. But we want to open up in Windows, Animation Editors. We want to open up two things. The Stokke Sheet, okay, it looks like that, and Windows Animation Editors Graph Editor. Okay, so these are Graph Editor might look familiar if you're familiar with After Effects. It's the same sort of thing. It's each individual value is graphed over time. So these are the frames, and then these are the values of, for instance, translate X. So how the camera moves in the X direction graphed over time. And then the Stokke Sheet is a way that you can adjust the spacing of your keyframes. So each of these black lines is a keyframe. See camera 3, here's the keyframe for camera 3. And if we want to adjust it, we just hit W for move, just like we would any other time. And middle click and drag, and we can adjust its position. So the camera, and we can actually drill down, and if we just want to adjust keyframes for the x-axis, we can do that, or just the focus distance, we can do that. But if we select this keyframe, it'll select all of them. Right? And I think that the camera it gets to its final spot too fast. So instead of ending on frame 60, I'm going to move it around, and maybe we end on frame 108. Okay, I'll hit play and we'll see how that looks. Just move it along, kind of turns the corner, and zooms in nice. I think that feels pretty nice. Okay, so that's the Stokke Sheet. Again, it's W to bring up the move tool, and then just middle click, select, and middle click and drag to move the keyframes around. Now, as it turns the corner, it feels a little bit kind of abrupt, not as smooth as it could be. And so that's where the Graph Editor comes in. And in the Graph Editor, I don't want to worry about the rotate, again, because that's driven by the look target. I just want to worry about the translation. So I'm just going to select Translate X, Y, and Z. And so, much like in After Effects, you've got these handles that you can use to adjust kind of the slope of the line. But you can't do too much with it by default. So if we right click on a keyframe and we say weighted tangents, okay, weighted tangents, that's going to allow us now to select these tangents and kind of drag them out and really increase the smoothness of the animation. I can do the same thing down here, right click, weighted tangents, and then kind of smooth them out, make this a nice even, easy transition. You can see that transition's already feeling better. It pauses for a moment, but it's definitely a much smoother transition than it was. So you can make those adjustments. I should also just mention that if you need to navigate around the Graph Editor, you can use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, Option middle click and drag to pan around. You've also got these three buttons up here to either frame everything, frame the playback range, or frame or center the view around the current time. So you can kind of navigate your viewport from there. There's a whole lot more the Graph Editor does, and we'll talk about that in a couple weeks. But just for this purpose, I wanted to give you a little bit more tools to kind of fine-tune the position. The last thing that I wanted to cover with this form of camera animation is if you wanted to adjust the keyframes as far as their values, you could just go to, like, say, frame 40, go to the channel box, just kind of move it around and do it that way. But if you need to visualize it a little bit better, you can go to the Animation tab, and this second option right here is Motion Trail. If I click on that, it's going to create a path, or it's going to create the path that the camera is following, including each of the keyframes. And what you can do, this is pretty cool, is you can, let's say frame 40, I want to adjust where it is. You can select that keyframe and move it, and it'll actually adjust the animation. Okay, so maybe you want frame 40 to end here. You know, you can do that. It makes the adjustment, and there you go. Now, I don't want to do that. I liked it where it was, but it's a nice thing to do. If you want to get rid of that motion trail, just go in the outliner. It's called motion trail. Right here, it'll probably be at the bottom. You can just delete it and get rid of it. So, once you have that, the rest of the process is the same. You know, once you're happy with your camera move, I'm just looking for 10-second moves here. You know, the camera animation should show off your scene. It should give a good look all the way around the building. So if you're not going to do just a regular 360, whatever fly-through that you come up with should still show off all of your work, right? You've been working hard on this for weeks, so make sure that you're, you know, showing off your work and not ignoring something that you spent a day and a half modeling, right? Yeah, I'm looking for these to be about 10 seconds or longer. You know, don't go in the 25-30 second range unless you know for sure you have enough time for rendering. But 10 to 15 seconds is pretty good. All right, we saw how fast the 10-second 360 animation was. That felt like a good speed. So that was okay. But yeah, from there, we just go to our rendering menu set, go to render sequence, make sure we set the right camera 3. And I'm also going to go to my render settings and make sure that my prefix is set to cam 3. And my end frame is going to be 108, I believe is what I finished on. Click close and hit render sequence and close. And it'll go through the same thing that it normally does to render a sequence. Once it finishes rendering the sequence, the last thing that you need to do is take these individual frames and make them a movie. And that we're going to do in After Effects. So I'm going to let this render just for a moment, and then we will go to After Effects. So I didn't let it finish rendering, but that's okay. Now we're going to open up. We can actually do After Effects or Premiere. They both work. We can do. I'll do After Effects. But yeah, both will work in a very similar way.
Which one's easier?
All right, so we are in After Effects, and you know, by default we get this blank untitled project. We've got our project window here, so I'm just going to double click on that, and that's going to open up the import dialog. You can also hit Command I or go to File, Import. And actually, before I do this, it's going to be helpful that if I take all of my renders here and put them in their own folder. So I select them all and new folder with selection, and this is Cottage Animation Demo. Okay, that's going to be a lot easier here in a second, because in After Effects we navigate to my project, Cottage Demo, and I go to Images, and I go to my folder. Whoops, that's not what I wanted to do. I got a little aggressive with my clicking. Let me delete that and we'll do that again. So, double click in there. We're in this folder. I just need to select the first image. And if we notice the options down here, importer JPEG sequence. So it recognizes that there's a sequence here. It recognizes that there's a consecutive number of frames. So I just select the first one and click Open, and it imports the sequence. This works the same way in Premiere. So once I have that, I can right-click on my image sequence, New Comp from Selection. It'll create a new composition that is the appropriate size. And I don't know why we have a quarter preview. We're going to go to full preview. It creates a new composition that's the appropriate size, the appropriate length. Right? You can see it scrolls through. So this is my other animation. It's much less exciting, but it's there. It also looks like, you know, we're at 30 frames a second, so I actually want to go to composition settings. So composition settings right up here, and I want to set this to 24 frames a second. Click OK. it's still, we'll just bring in that out point. There we go. Alright, so once we have that set, we just go to composition, add to render queue, and then we've got our render settings down here where it says lossless. We can go QuickTime and RGB. We want to choose format options. Oh, this doesn't have H.264. Usually use H.264, but I guess we'll go like ProRes LT, just a light ProRes. It's more than we need, but that's easy. Click OK, and then we set output to 2, and I'm going to output it to my movies folder. Click save, and click render. It renders super fast because it's really just compiling a bunch of images. And then back in my project, here's my finished render, all nice and pretty. So that's how it works in After Effects. I'll go through it again real quick in Premiere because it works very similar, just the export's a little bit different. So whichever you're more comfortable in. I think you can even do it in Photoshop. I think. Alright, so Premiere, new project, and we'll call it export will be fine. And I'm just going to save it to the desktop, which is a terrible habit, but it'll work for now. Actually, no, I won't. I'll put it in my folder. It's easy enough. Okay, the defaults are fine for the rest of it. In Premiere, again, we just go to our project window, double-click to import. Same sort of thing. Navigate to the first image, and it should import the whole sequence. Okay, maybe Premiere doesn't import the sequence by default. You might have to select them all and import. Yeah, okay. So it's a little bit more complicated. There it is. Okay. That's what it was, is that the option was hidden by default. So let me delete that. Import, select the first image, go to options, turn on image sequence, and now it should find the sequence. Yes, it found the sequence. I want to adjust the not the properties. I want to adjust the interpret footage. I want this to be 24 frames a second. Then I can new sequence from click. There it is. And the export out of Premiere is, let's see, I don't remember where it is in the menu because I always use the key command. It's Command M to render. Sequence, export, media, gives you this window, and we can choose QuickTime. Okay, so here we have H.264. We'll choose that, and just high bitrate is fine. You can also choose, like, the YouTube 1080 preset is a really good preset. I export a lot of stuff with that preset. Here's where you can name it and set the location. So I will again go to my folder and movies, click save. Over here in video, we want to match the source. So 960 by 540 is what this render is set, but yours is going to say 1920 by 1080. And click export. Do that. It exports. It's done. I can quit this. I don't need to save. And here is that. It looks the exact same as the other one because it does the same thing, except this was done with H.264, which is a bit smaller file than the than ProRes, but they both work. So that is the last step in exporting your movies.